And we're back for another episode of Standpoint. I'm Gabe Groisman. Today I'm sitting in the beautiful Rumble Studios in Washington, D.C. I'm in town to present at the CUFI, the Christian United for Israel Conference, on the myth of isolationism. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this episode. I had to come into the studio while on this trip because my producer and sister-in-law Tila was able to score an amazing interview for today with someone I've admired for quite some time, but has really made it and is making a huge impact since the October 7th war began in Israel, when Hamas brutally attacked southern Israel and killed over 1,200 people, taking over 240 innocent lives hostage. His clarity in standing up for the West, for Israel, and against the barbarity of Hamas and its vast network of supporters has gained international acclaim. Whether it's in formal debates, television, interviews, books, or in written columns, his words always hit the spot, the impact of which is leaving his opponents scratching their heads and the supporters of the West, of Israel, cheering in support. Our guest today is none other than Douglas Murray, who's joining us today via Skype. Hi, Douglas. How are you?
Hi, very good to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Just a little more on you, because I want to make sure it's interesting. There's some people who they live by you. Everything you write, they consume it, and they follow what you're writing online, what you're saying on television, and others who are just getting to know you here in America, which is a shame because everyone must. So Douglas is a prominent commentator, author, and journalist known for his incisive analysis on contemporary political and cultural issues. He's the associate editor of The Spectator and a prolific writer. He's the best-selling author of 7 books, with his most recent book, which I have with me here in the studio, The War on the West, which I read over this past weekend. In this book, Murray delves into the cultural and political war being waged against Western societies. It's brilliant, clear, and concise, and thought-provoking. On today's episode, we'll be exploring a range of critical issues with Murray. We'll discuss the recent protests in Western capitals like the one I'm sitting in today and what they're a symptom of. We'll examine the global response to the Israel-Hamas conflict and Murray's strong support for Israel amidst these debates. Finally, we'll consider the ultimate question, which is how the West can actually win this war. So welcome again, Douglas, and thanks so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
So I know you're here virtually, but I just wanted to announce you will be coming to the United States, actually to South Florida very soon for your Save the West tour. You have a sold-out show in Fort Lauderdale. It's sold out almost immediately. I'm not surprised. And we are here to announce that on September 10th at the beautiful Fillmore Theater in South Beach in Miami Beach, there'll be another show. The tickets are available at Live Nation. I need everyone to listen to this carefully. That's why I'm doing it at the top of the show. There's a special code for our listeners. The code is Israel, no surprise. Code Israel. If you go on Live Nation to buy the tickets, they will be available to you before they are made available to the general public. Douglas, anything else you want to say about the tour you've got coming?
There's a lot to say. It's going to be very exciting. We're now 4 cities at the beginning and sold out wonderfully, very fast in Fort Lauderdale. So I've added this show in Miami on the 10th of September. I'm also going to be in DC, New York at the Beacon, and LA, and other dates are going to be announced soon.
First of all, it's incredible you're doing that. And if you think about the time that we're in, Douglas, people are so hungry for clear and concise and just getting information and just getting it straight. Just in my cab ride over here, my Uber over here, I was speaking to the driver about the war between Israel and Hamas and the protests on the street, because that's what I do, right? Just speak to people. And he says, the problem is it's impossible to find the truth. And I think that actually says something. So people are really excited to hear you and hear what you have to say. So thanks for doing that.
It's a pleasure.
So Douglas, I just finished your book and I was basically jumping up and down. You published it in 2021, 2022, and it seems to be like a thesis as to what's happening around the world and the attacks on the West, attacks on religion, etc. And everything we're seeing, if that's a thesis, everything we've seen on the streets since October 7th around the world seem to be approving of that thesis. Can you just take a step back and tell us a little bit about your book, The War on the West, and what the thesis of the book is?
Yeah, the War on the West came out in 2022. It was sort of the third of a set of books that I wrote. The Strange Death of Europe, that came out in 2017, which was about some of the challenges of integration, of migration, and so on, particularly in Europe, but also in America. And then the Madness of Crowds, which was about the gender, race, and identity politics that have now suffused everything, and that came out in 2019. And The War on the West was a sort of culmination of 3 books. And it's really about, the intense self-hatred that is going on in Western societies at the moment. Mainly, it has to be said, coming out from America. And it's this thing I described. There's lots of different anti-Western attitudes. There's a sort of form of Arab anti-Westernism. There's Chinese anti-Westernism. The one I'm really interested in is Western anti-Westernism. Why it is that so many people in our societies, in liberal, free, democratic societies, have ended up taking this stance that, we are the cause of all evil and wrong in the world, and that nobody else is really responsible for anything, that our societies in America, Britain, Europe should be judged by our worst aspects and everyone else judged only by their best. There's a very strange double standard that has emerged, and which I explain the origins of, I like to think, in the war on the West. How did this come about? It's very unnatural. Most people want to be proud of the society they're in, let alone if there are lots of reasons to be proud of it, as there are in America. But this has, as you say, I mean, this has sort of become, if I say so myself, slightly more prescient, because everything we've seen since the 7th of October on the streets of American cities, American campuses, is all a result of what I described 2 years ago. This desire to lambast free Western liberal societies and blame us for everything, blame ourselves for everything. And Israel, of course, ends up absolutely caught in the crosshairs on that. It's seen by the people who criticize America. And by the way, I have no problem with criticism, and criticism itself is a good thing. It's one of the virtues of a liberal society. But the intense self-criticism that becomes self-loathing and self-destruction, Israel has become the sort of poster child for in many countries, particularly in America. Why is it that we can now predict so clearly what side people are going to be on? Why should it be that, that people have views incredibly half-formed or completely ill-informed, perhaps like the person you were speaking to earlier, who decide to throw their lot in, not with the society that's most like ours in the Middle East, Israel, but to groups that are fanatically anti-us in every way, not just anti-Israel, anti-American, anti-British, anti-European. I find it astonishing, and I wanted to diagnose this problem. I tried to do so, and I try to warn people about where it inevitably goes.
Well, and you do a great job doing that. I mean, just some examples that you talk about to illustrate what you were mentioning, where you talk about how in California, if I'm not mistaken, there's ethnic studies that include praying or at least recognizing Aztec gods without recognizing the fact that they were also cannibals, for example, or Michael Moore's book and tour about how the white people are to blame for everything. And if I recall, and I just read this a couple of days ago, so hopefully I get it right. You say it's as if he has never heard about the African continent or the Arab Peninsula or terror groups in those areas who have caused so much harm around the world. And that's something it's like sort of selective intellectualism in a way, where they're just picking one part and ignoring the rest. And and the argument that you seem to make a lot is, if this is bad, then what's the alternative? And when you examine the alternative, it always seems vastly worse, right? I mean, is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I think you might exaggerate by saying it's anti-intellectualism. I don't think it's intellectualism at all. I mean, it's a sort of knee-jerk movement that finds it easiest to look at the world and assume that we're responsible for any problems. And I mean, there are many problems that the West has been able to cause, many great wrongs that it's been able to right. But every society's past is complicated. It would be very strange to look at any other country and treat it this way. Turkey is the successor of the Ottoman Empire, was the heart of the Ottoman Empire. But I don't think anyone would look at modern day Turkey and decide to solely look at it through the worst aspects of the Ottoman Empire, let alone to punish or blame Turkish people today for what was done 300 years ago. It would be a sort of obscene thing to do. It would show that you rather disliked the people and the country. Well, I think it's the same thing. And as I say, although Western societies can do things wrong, of course, and have done, but there are many things in the world that go wrong that have absolutely nothing to do with us and have not been our fault at all. But it's a sort of easy way always to avoid needing to know anything. to say it must be something we've done. It's a pretty unnatural thing to be taught into, but an enormous number of people now think that.
Yeah, well, and look, before October 7th, it seemed to be almost conspiratorial, and I'm sure that's a lot of the responses you got to your book. On one side, it was positive, I can't believe he's saying these things, this is great, but on the other side, that this is just being in a way conspiratorial or over worried about all these things. These are just concepts that are being spoken about, whether it's CRT or DEI or white rage, which I think you speak about also in your book, the concept of white rage. And in the Jewish world, when we were talking about these issues, saying how these movements, the DEI movement in particular, CRT, these are movements that the first to fall with this movement are going to be the Jews, because for those on the far left, the Jews are the ultimate whites, right? If the whites are the problem, the Jews are the ultimate whites. Whether that's factually right or wrong is irrelevant. And Israel is a quote unquote white society, even though again that's factually wrong. It's a majority Middle Eastern Jews, not Eastern European Jews. But we've been seeing it for a long time. What's interesting is that after October 7th, the tipping point was this war with Hamas, which seemed like, for me at least, it surprised me because it seemed like such an obvious moment in history where the world, whatever that means, would coalesce around those who were attacked so brutally on October 7th. But it sort of was a reductio ad absurdum. It took it to the absurd point, which now proves how false it is, but it still took us all the way there. Were you surprised that this was the tipping point for the world to really start seeing what's going on?
Well, first of all, we'll see if it is a tipping point. I mean, quite often things seem to be when you're in the moment, but prove to be forgotten.
That's fair.
And I'm afraid that a lot of the world has simply not woken up to the reality that Israel has sadly been woken up into. Or being reminded of. It is stunning to me. I mean, I'm not surprised, but I'm still shocked that, for instance, after the massacre of October the 7th, there was no meaningful movement anywhere in the world, as far as I can see, that was simply anti-Hamas. That simply said, we will march against this terrible group that's carried out these atrocities. Why wasn't there? I mean, in France, there have been terrible terror attacks, nothing on the scale of the 7th, but very significant terror attacks to France. And they have led to, huge movements of solidarity around the world with our French brothers and sisters and friends who have undergone such terrible horrors. Why did that not happen after the 7th? And some people will say, well, it's because Israel immediately responded. And actually, it's not the case. There was more than a beat between the 7th and Israel responding and trying to get back the hostages and to destroy Hamas. There was more than a beat. Why were the cities of America and everywhere else not filled with people marching against Hamas, saying, not in our name, condemning these barbarian assaults? And I think that says a lot, not about Israel, but about the way in which a lot of people in the West view the conflict in the Middle East and the reality that Israel has been suffering and suffered so terribly that day, but which we suffer as well. I mean, we have experienced in America in particular, we've experienced this kind of terrorism. The thing is that people go to sleep again very fast, and they start dreaming again. And that's where I think a lot of people in the US have been, sadly.
Yeah, what role do you think anti-Semitism plays in the West's dissonance, if there is some, to what's happening in Israel? If it's not the wake up, if there's not the tipping point, like you say, if people don't wake up to it, in the US, we're seeing a lot of arguments where those of us who are standing up for Israel and what's happening in the Middle East generally will say, oh, it's just a Jewish issue, it's just Israel, and they kind of separate themselves, whether it's on the right, frankly, or on the left. On the left, it's much more, right? On the left, they're looking at it like victim and oppressor, and if by any means necessary, the victim can attack the oppressor. But what role do you think anti-Semitism is playing in the way the West is viewing this continued conflict?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think that I mentioned in The Madness of Crowds the way in which you could see that the Oppression Olympics, which is now sort of completely rife in American society in particular, where the person who can claim to have suffered most wins and becomes a moral arbiter. I mean, it's a preposterous idea, but it's nevertheless one we're in. I said in the Mountains of Crowds where that we already knew that led. I mean, there's an example I gave from an American university, which in 2018 or so started, passing out this thing of, the oppression hierarchy, the sort of pyramid of oppression. Lo and behold, who could be surprised that the Jews were not only not regarded as people who have been oppressed, which is, I mean, itself beyond belief that anyone could be so ignorant, but that Jews were actually the ultimate oppressor. That, as you say, they're sort of the ultimate white people. And then all of the other accusations that come in, that Israel is a colonialist project, where actual fact, if anything, it was an anti-colonialist project. Literally, the country I'm from, Britain, was ruling the mandate Palestine, and Israel emerges as an anti-colonialist movement. Yet now it's being recast, has been recast for a new generation as a colonial movement, a colonialist movement, instead of being a country that has suffered enormous hostility throughout its existence since the creation of the state. Instead of recognizing that, it's seen that Israel is the oppressor. And instead of recognizing, as you say, that Israel is an incredibly diverse society, they decide that Israelis are the ultimate white people, therefore the ultimate white supremacists. This is something I've spoken about a lot since the 7th, which is the way in which, as my late friend Rabbi Jonathan Sachs often said, the way in which anti-Semitism is a shape-shifting virus, and that, it has come from the right historically. It can still come from the right. Today, politically in the West, it comes more from the left, whether it's Mélenchon in France or the extremities of the Democratic Party in America. And it can, anti-Semitism can come from people who believe that the Jews are too integrated into society, and also that they're not integrated enough. It can come from people who hate the Jews for not having a state, for being rootless cosmopolitans, and also then hate them for having a state and defending it. This is obviously a manifestation. These are all manifestations of an ancient hatred and virus, which, to my mind, flares up with some regularity. But it's something which Jews and non-Jews have to be alert to, because, as we know, anti-Semitism is, when it's allowed to run riot in a society, is a precursor to everything else falling apart. And I think it's incumbent not just, Jews, there are, lots of reasons why Jews realize and recognize this and wake up to this early. But I think everyone else, like myself, is not Jewish, needs to wake up to this too. Don't forget that the protesters in the city that you are sitting in currently, in DC, where I was on Wednesday, when the Israeli Prime Minister gave his speech to joint sessions of Congress, don't forget that what he said in the speech about the way in which the terrorists and the extremists and the radicals in the Middle East and here at home, the way that they target Israel is not because they target Israel first and last. It is purely they target it first. But they make it very clear, as the Prime Minister said last Wednesday, they make it very clear that they want to destroy America next. And, I wrote in my New York Post column last week, the protesters on the street outside the Capitol prove Netanyahu's point for him more effectively than he could have done. Because what were the flags that they tore down outside Union Station but the American flag, and then burnt it on the streets of the Capitol? It wasn't just abolish Israel. The Liberty Bell replica, also in DC, was immediately graffitied with abolish the USA. These people aren't hiding the connection they see between Israel and America and every other Western society in between. They make it so obvious. It's just that very, very large numbers of people in our society don't want to draw that link or want to excuse the link or pretend it away. And I don't think that's a wise maneuver at all.
Yeah, and the sad part of it, and again, you hit the nail on the head, but the sad part of it is that the American people don't see it, but mainly because the media doesn't cover it that way, right? You would expect that after the protests that you saw on the Capitol when Netanyahu was speaking, like you say, they weren't even protests against Israel in most part. They were protests against the United States, saying Hamas is coming here, burning American flags, vandalizing American monuments. That would be on the cover of every newspaper. This is our capital, for God's sakes, right? But it wasn't. In fact, they talked about how quickly it was cleaned up, right? And how it was resolved. And by the next morning, everyone was so proud that the parks people did a great job, and they did do a great job cleaning up all the graffiti, and it looked like nothing happened. But something did happen, right? Something big happened. But my question to you is why? Why do you think the masses are so easily swayed with these false narratives and these false positions and these self-hateful positions?
Well, I think that it falls into two groups, as what I call the sinister and the silly. The sinister are the ones who really do know what they're doing. They really do know what they're protesting for. When I was standing outside the Capitol waiting to get in the other day, there were mobs of people walking past, screaming at, among other things, the two policemen I was speaking to, very professional, very good Capitol Hill policemen, both of whom incidentally were black. And as we were standing there, the people started shouting through megaphones at these policemen, effing white supremacists. I mean, so what's the message? Just, took it, but I mean, it was unbelievable. And so I think some people are just very, very sinister. They're for Hamas, they're for the eradication of Israel, and they really do think that it would be a good idea and would improve American society if America was abolished. Those people are deeply, deeply sinister and evil individuals. But I think there's a second group, and maybe larger, which is the silly, the people who've been badly misled and who are ripe to be misled. I'm thinking of people like the kids on college campuses who can't possibly know anything about the conflict that they are sitting in tents to object to, as if, by the way, sitting in a tent on another continent could ever persuade a democratic government not to defend its people. I mean, it's apart from anything, it's narcissistic and grandiose to even think that they have something to say about this.
That's right.
I mean, they have the right to. I just think it's an enormous waste of their energies and everyone else's time. But these are the people who are silly. I mean, who do not seem to realize what they're doing. And I hope, I mean, the sinister types, the pro-Hamas types, I'm never going to win around, and I don't think anyone can. But the silly, I think they are ripe for, at some point, growing up and being better educated about this conflict and situation that they're hollering about so incredibly ignorantly.
Douglas, where do you see the media falling? Is the media in the silly or the ignorant? I mean, just today, we're recording this on Monday. We'll air it on Wednesday. Just today, the Washington Post front page was a picture of a Druze funeral. Druze are people who live in Israel, mostly, by the way, but these are the Druze that live in Israel in the Golan Heights, serve in the military. There's a joke in Israel that if you drop a pin in a Druze community, you're going to hit either military commander or a police commander because they all serve the country. Like 12 Druze children were killed by a Hezbollah rocket over the weekend on Saturday, I believe. And the Washington Post cover page was a picture of that funeral, but the headline wasn't about how these 12 Druze children were killed while playing soccer. It said Israel responds with rocket attacks to Lebanon, and I'm paraphrasing. It's not in front of me. There's just one of so many examples. So, do you think the media is more on the silly side or on the sinister side?
Well, it's a bit of both, actually. I mean, there is some media like Al Jazeera that is clearly on the sinister side. I mean, Al Jazeera has had quite a number of their so-called journalists now inside Gaza revealed to have been taking part in the terrorism, including one contributor to Al Jazeera who was found to have been holding Israeli hostages in his home in Gaza, and was filing copy for other press agencies, moaning about the situation of the civilians in Gaza whilst having hostages in his home. I mean, if that's not sinister, I don't know what is. A lot of the press is deeply silly and uninformed. Often, though, I have to say, with a sinister tinge. That disgraceful Washington Post front page it just immediately reminded me of the first war in Israel that I saw, which was the 2006 war, the second Lebanon war, the Hezbollah war, which looks terribly like it might happen again. Because, of course, Hezbollah were meant to pull their weaponry and fighters back, terrorists back into Lebanon. They didn't, and the UN hasn't bothered to police it, and Hezbollah's rebuilt up its arsenal of 150 or 60,000 rockets in the last 18 years. It reminded me so much when I saw that Washington Post cover of that conflict, because it was the same thing then. Hezbollah fires all these rockets into Israel. Israel responds, and you will see the next day, I remember it so clearly in 2006, you would see the next day, Israel attacks Lebanon. As if Israel was just eager to attack Lebanon and there was nothing that the Lebanese had done. No, this is Hezbollah. This is Iran's proxy in Lebanon trying to start a war and carrying out unbelievable atrocities. And that the press would join in on reporting the response rather than focusing on the primary issue is completely typical, I'm afraid, of a large portion of the media. They do this consistently. It was the same, unbelievably, people have sort of already memory hold this, but it was the same after the 7th of October. By the 8th, already, the headlines were, about the Israeli retaliation. The media is obsessed by that, absolutely obsessed. What will Israel do now? They forget the primary story. Israel would not have to do anything if it wasn't continuously being assaulted by these jihadist groups who want to eradicate it. And so, yes, but there is a great amount of ignorance too. I was watching over the weekend after this terrible atrocity against the Druze, which is, I find the Druze, I've spent a lot of time with members of that community, they're remarkable people. And it's just unbelievably appalling what happened at the weekend. But, the front page of the BBC website referred to this happening in Israel-occupied Golan. So it immediately suggests there's something the Israelis are doing wrong. They're occupying the Golan, therefore
it's their fault.
Yeah, kind of. How could anyone resist rocketing a dozen school children as they're playing football? It's morally despicable that anyone would fall into that. But that is where large numbers of people in the media, that's where they sit.
Yeah, and again, the facts don't seem to matter to them or to anyone. And the fact that there's been a atrocious civil war happening in Syria for quite some time, and if the Golan Heights were still in Syrian hands, not only would Israel be being attacked on a daily basis, but those very Druze would probably have been slaughtered in that civil war as well. It's something that doesn't seem relevant to the media today, to the narrative they're trying to push. Let me ask you a question, Douglas. Why do you think your voice has really been cutting through so much? Because it really has, and I'm sorry to ask you to be a little immodest for a moment, but there's an array, if not an ocean, of voices in response today to anything that's happening. And now the war in Israel and Hamas is the biggest story since the beginning of October. It still is probably the biggest story in the world. And there's all these voices, and everything is sort of a mishmash, even people arguing for both sides. But your voice really cuts through. What do you think about your approach is different that other people should learn from?
Well, gosh, it's not really for me to say. I'm glad if it does cut through. I hope it does. I suppose I don't spend much time in self-reflection, but maybe I say some things that other people would like to say and haven't said yet, or have been thinking and haven't said. I do tend to say things as I see them, for better or for worse. And I think some people maybe appreciate that. I suppose, one other thing I would mention, which is enormously saddening to me, but which I've heard a lot from readers and listeners, is the number of Jewish people who say that they felt very alone since the 7th and have wondered. Lots of my liberal Jewish friends, who, as many of them have said to me, I was there for BLM. I was there for Me Too. After the 7th, no one was there for me. And no one was there for us. I think a lot of people have been on a rather sharp learning curve, a very disturbing learning curve since October, where people they thought would be allies were not just not allies, were actively hostile. Perhaps in that situation, somebody who isn't Jewish but is completely on the side of Israel in its fight against barbarism, perhaps just the sense of being alone, hopefully feels a little less alone when you know there are people out there who are on your side. And it saddens me when people say that they found that from reading me or listening to me, because it makes me feel like, I mean, why should Israelis or Jews feel alone? You know, and I think what I say and what I write about, what I describe is nothing else. It's what I see with my own eyes, and I've spent most of the last year in Israel. But it's also just seems to me obvious that anyone should say it who's not just got their eyes open, but has got any moral sense. There are times when there's no ifs and no buts, and this is such a time.
Yeah, my friend Ambassador Ron Dermer says often that people love saying there's two sides to every story, and the truth is always somewhere in the middle. But that's not the case. Sometimes your side of the story is right. And I think what you do right, and I'm sorry I posed the question that way because I made you think through it in a way you probably usually don't. But I think what you do mostly in a way that's very different than others is, first of all, you're educated on the subject. You don't just talk any talking points, and that's clear. But secondly, and you can see this actually through all the books you've published, it makes it all make sense, seeing you now on the world stage, standing up for Israel and what's happening in Israel, but is that you say what you see without being afraid of the consequences.
Yes.
You did that in your book about the migration, the Great Migration from the Arab Peninsula and Africa to Europe, and what the consequences of that were. People called you many different things. You were just calling things as you saw them and explaining what you were seeing and what you thought the impact could be. You're doing the same with Israel, and I see people here, not just in the Jewish community, but people here all over America trying always to equivocate their words and their position in a way to try to make it fit into the narrative that they think is what's acceptable.
Yes.
And from where I see you reject that, then you just come in and you say, here's what I see. And that's
Yes.
what it is.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, what else can one do? And what's the point of being a writer and not saying things as you see them? You know, I think that I think there are a lot of cowardly ways out. I don't say cowardly. Some people, it's not cowardice. It's just they want to fit in, or they have an idea of a social circle they want to be in, or a political environment they want to be in, and they caveat or they couch their interpretation of events around that. I don't particularly need to be in a group or in a clique or a set. I don't need to be thought to have said the correct thing to have said. I just like to say what I believe to be true. And when you do that, my experience is, by the way, because there might be some people watching who have had the experience, particularly since the 7th, of, you know, falling out with people or losing people you thought were friends because they just don't have any sympathy for this situation. And, you know, I would say to them, you know, having shrugged off all of those friends in my life many, many years ago, it's more important to orient yourself towards the truth than towards where you fit in. Because if you orient yourself towards the truth, my experience is that you will lose some friends, but the much better thing is you'll gain much better friends, and you'll find that in your life you're a bit more surrounded by people who are also interested in things that are true, and not just in being, you know, seen to be correct on something. So I hope more people do take that view.
It's interesting when you say that. All I keep thinking about is in the religious Jewish view of the world, we always think about there is a set of morality and ethics and a code for how to live your life, and that's in the Bible. And generations and things will pass, things will come every day, every couple decades, things will change of what people think is right and wrong. But there is one thing that if you stick to it, it's everlasting. It's sort of it reminds me of what you're saying about the truth, which is really part of that. Now, you have been recognized by many people. I was excited to see you in the crowd, like you mentioned, in the joint session at Congress with Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking. You were sitting next to Elon Musk. My understanding is you were both guests of the prime minister. How was that experience?
It was terrific. I've met Elon Musk a number of times, but it was very good to see him again. He's been stalwart in the last 8 or 9 months, and has really used his voice for good. And it was wonderful to see him there. It was a very moving day, and of course, extremely interesting, as I say, to see you know what was happening in the heart of Congress and what was happening on the streets of DC. And this is another reminder of the fact that this is very complicated for politicians to sort out. A lot of people clearly, and we saw this, I think, in certain people who were absent from the speech. I think a lot of people imagine that they can placate people who really are not up for negotiating. I think that the crowds outside of the Capitol Wednesday who were calling for the abolition of the United States, what, you want to abolish the United States a bit? You really want to pander to these people? You know, the people who are supporting Hamas, do you think they'll be happy if you say they can just kill some of the Jews? I mean, I think the whole thing, apart from anything else, it was a wonderful day, but I think it was also a salutary day for politicians in America to remember some of the people who are trying to make them negotiate, or one side or the other, their way out of this situation. And, you know, in reality, a small but very voluble group of radicals in the United States have been doing making an awful lot of noise. And there is a possibility that some politicians will regard that as being the voice of the people in some way. I think it's very important for people to understand these are highly motivated people, highly ideologically motivated people who punch above their weight in the public discourse, but do not represent the citizens of America, and should not and do not represent the values.
Yeah, we see that reflected in our elections here in the United States. Like, you know, the media tells us one thing, and sort of public discourse makes you think that the loud minority is in fact the majority when it's not.
Right.
But the war against the West, like you lay it out in your book, it's against religion, against historical figures, history itself, the truth, religion, and culture. But I'd love to get your take just on two things, and we'll end with these things. One is, if you could put a pin on who's waging this war, 'cause I think that's the hardest part to really understand. This sort of amorphous thing. All of the pieces of it I see is true, but it's hard to understand who's behind it, and then what we can do to actually win the war.
Well, my thing, you know, there's a famous, I think it was Napoleon who was said first that if your enemy is making a mistake, don't interrupt them. And I think that lots of people, lots of international powers and organizations that dislike Western society have found it very useful to push some of the things that are happening in our midst. What I described in The War on the West, this movement that has come up mainly within American academia in recent decades, that has got us into this cycle of the oppression, hierarchy, and much more. I think that a lot of the people who are doing this have done it because it's gestated in America and it's just come up. But there's undoubtedly a lot of our rivals and indeed enemies on the world stage who find this enormously helpful. Netanyahu mentioned in his speech on Wednesday that it's been said by the leaders of the intelligence community in the US. They have identified the fact that Iran is funding and backing and perhaps even organizing many of the protests in the US, including the protests on US campuses. That shouldn't come as a surprise, of course. I mean, all that was so coordinated, so similar everywhere it happened, that it was clear that somebody was behind it, something was behind it. Of course, it's very striking that this movement, the campus movement, also got praise from the supreme leader in Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. So they clearly enjoy pushing this, among others, and that's clearly been going on. It's something which I think that Americans should really wake up to. I mean, Iran wants to destabilize and destroy Israel, but it has said, of course, that it also wants to destabilize and destroy America, which the supreme leader and the Ayatollah is referred to, of course, as the Great Satan. they have a plan, and they've been pretty active. I mean, it's only a year or bit over a year since we discovered that an Iranian cell was trying to assassinate former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former National Security Advisor John Bolton in America. It's an brave Iranian female expat who's against the regime, who has had her life at risk with an assassination squad trying to get her in New York. And don't forget that it was a British novelist of Indian birth, Salman Rushdie, who was very nearly killed when he was stabbed on stage multiple times 2 summers ago at a literary festival in New York State, after 30 years of the Iranian regime calling for the murder of that British novelist, Salman Rushdie. So I think people really have to wake up to the fact there are things that we are doing in our societies which are very destructive of our own societies, but it's very helpful to certain rivals and competitors and enemies on the world stage that we're doing that, and they will do anything they can to help us out in this act of self.
Yeah, from my perspective, I'm the ultimate optimist. Everything you're saying is accurate. I believe, though, this is the tipping point, and it's our job to make it the tipping point. And we're seeing it in capitals all over the world. We saw it in London, people pushing back. We're seeing it now here in the United States. Hopefully this election will start changing things, but there's a lot of work to be done because the infiltration that we're seeing from those waging the war on the West are deep in our institutions, not just in our universities, but in our corporations and in these global institutions that we see like the United Nations and UNRWA, et cetera. And it doesn't end. It continues, whether it's the ICC or the ICJ, or just it's infiltrated every aspect of our society. So it's, we have a long war ahead of us, but we have to continue to battle on the battlefield of ideas. And luckily we have people like you. Douglas, thank you so much for your time. I know you're coming to South Florida. You're so excited about it. I can tell you the South Florida community is excited to have you for your Save the West tour. Guys, the show in Fort Lauderdale was sold out almost immediately, so they added a September 10th show at the Fillmore in Miami Beach. Tickets are available now at Live Nation. You can use the code Israel to buy your tickets now before they go on sale to the general public. Douglas, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everything you're doing, for your continued efforts, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. See you in Florida.
All right. Take care, everybody else. See you at the next episode. Please be sure to like, follow, subscribe, do all the great things you do to support podcasts, and see you next time.